Justice decided to outsource interpreting services and awarded a contract to Applied Language Solutions, ALS, last February. A report by the National Audit Office says that the privatisation became fully operational before it was ready and was initially wholly inadequate. Some 5,000 complaints later, we ask, what has gone wrong? With me in the studio is Dr. Nadia Hussain, who is a legal Arabic interpreter and part of the Interpreters for Justice group, Jonathan Clifton, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Public Policy Research, and Sheila Lawler, the Director of the think tank Politia. Iskander Fernandez, Senior Criminal Solicitor at IBB Solicitors, joins us on the phone. Iskander Fernandez, let me bring you in first. Have your clients been affected directly by this?
I can first of all start off by explaining the system that was in place before this contract was awarded. It wasn't fallible, but in terms of the access that clients had to interpreters, it was something that was fairly smooth running, weren't any major issues. But since February, it's been very, very inconsistent. You would have defendants waiting an inordinate amount of time in the cells waiting for interpreters to turn up, either because the interpreter hasn't been booked in time, or the message hasn't got across to the body that organises a person to be in court. It results in clients waiting, as I mentioned, for an enormous amount of time for somebody to come to court to assist them. Bail applications are delayed. Individuals are denied their access to justice, and individuals who, on all accounts, would normally be granted bail because of a lack of previous convictions or because the case against them isn't as strong as one would perceive it, are unfortunately denied the right to get into court quickly and be released immediately because of the problems that we face with these interpreters not being booked properly, or more so these days, the fact that the quality of the interpreters has been particularly poor.
I see. Well, and we've asked Capita, who are the company that now own ALS, for a comment, and they said this to us. The translation and interpreting business has been able to draw upon the resources, skills and track record of Capita following its acquisition. This has helped the business to enhance and strengthen the delivery of its service, with over 95% of booking requests now fulfilled, compared with 65% in the first month of the contract. This performance is continuing to improve. While we cannot comment on individual hearings, there have always been some cases which have been held back because of a lack of available interpreters at a specific time. This is not a new problem because of the new service. It is actually one of the inefficiencies that the new system was brought in to counter, and it will do so when it is operating optimally. Now, we also asked the Ministry of Justice for their comment, and they told us this. The Ministry of Justice has strong reasons to change the old interpreter booking system, which was inadequate in several respects, and this has been acknowledged by the National Audit Office. Complaints have also fallen dramatically, and we will continue to push for further improvement. We remain confident that the contract will make the expected savings of £15 million a year for the Ministry of Justice. So, Iskander, do you think those are reasonable answers to the concerns?
I think the words an improvement is something that really needs to be taken in with a pinch of salt. If you start off from a position where the service in its own right was inadequate, inconsistent, and just simply not fit for the purpose, any slight improvement would be seen as dramatic. And whilst I accept that there have been slight improvements, unfortunately, defendants are still remaining in the cells. Cases are not being heard on time. Interpreters are being asked to come to court. They do attend and don't know the procedure that needs to be adopted when they get into the courtroom itself. They do not know where to stand. I think there was a comment made by one of the chairman of the Magistrates Association, said that individuals are left in the dock. Things are being said by the prosecution, the defence and the magistrate, and unfortunately the interpreter who's sitting alongside him or her is not interpreting everything that's being said and simply providing the defendant with snippets. So what the interpreter may objectively think is not important is important, and you have on occasions the chairman of the bench, defence, the prosecution, making sure and really directing their attention to the interpreter and advising them to interpret what is being said in the court proceedings. Now, the comments made by the Ministry of Justice and the fact that the previous regime was inadequate, I wouldn't confirm that at all. I wouldn't go hand in hand with that, simply because, although, as I mentioned before, the system was not fallible, it worked. And when there was a lack of an interpreter, either because the police hadn't booked someone in to come to represent the defendant or assist the defendant, and one phone call would be more than sufficient, whereas now you would have to make more than one phone call, and GP court support staff would have to make more than one phone call to get somebody there. And the quality has been drastically reduced from what it was previously.
Well, Iskander, thanks very much for joining us. I just want to move the discussion on a bit now. Dr. Nadia Hussain, would you concur with that it's not only that there are often interpreters not available and so people are staying in the cells when they shouldn't be, but when they get to court, the quality of the service has declined?
Yes, very much, because they send unqualified interpreters who have no experience whatsoever and are not vetted as well. I recently worked with a solicitor who told me they sent her an interpreter and turned to be has a criminal record because she worked on her case and was fraud. So she refused that interpreter to work with her.
So, and the point that was being made there that that defendants are only being given snippets of the court proceedings, that's a very serious accusation.
Because they have no experience. They send people who never interpret before, who have no qualification, have no experience.
So, and did you think that the old system was flawed? Iskander was saying.
No, the old system worked very well. As far as I know, there was no complaint.
And so now, how widespread do you think this is? Do you have an estimate of how many people are being held in the cells when they would otherwise have been processed through the court system?
No, I have no number.
And other interpreters, are they as concerned as you? You have a group of people who are concerned about this?
We, a group of interpreters, they decided to boycott working for the court because the court deals only with that agency, Applied Language Solution.
And there are some cases here in the reports about the ALS ringing up totally unqualified people and asking them to work.
And even they ask them to provide friends, relatives, and sometimes they source interpreters from a kebab shop.
Jonathan, I mean, this is a remarkably bad case, isn't it? I mean, these are people whose freedom depends on this service. Is this something that should ever be outsourced, do you think?
I think that there can be a role for outsourcing in some bits of the public sector, but where the thing is very easy and clear to contract. So something like running a call centre for the council, that doesn't have to be necessarily run by the local council, they could outsource that. But where we have more complex services, things like the judiciary system, things like schools and hospitals, it gets much harder to ask a private company to contract because they have very different incentives. Their essential role is trying to make a profit for their shareholders, and therefore they might not be quite so interested in things like the quality of the service. And so if we're going to try and outsource something like legal interpreting, I think you need much better regulations and the government needs to be much clearer about who they're giving these contracts to and how they're monitoring them.
Sheila, I mean, whatever the case might be in other areas, this surely is something that needs to be in public hands.
Evidently, if these claims are true, this service has let people down. It's nothing short of disgraceful if the law can't operate fairly and rapidly. And therefore this particular case must be looked into. It's absolutely obvious what skills an interpreter needs. They need to be very good linguists to begin with in both the language of the accused and the language of the country, i.e. English. But they also need, as Nadia said, a great deal of experience, and they need to know exactly what the rules are. Now, if the failings are, as suggested here, this is very serious. You're not going to solve that by saying no outsourcing. You're going to solve it by saying we would require, as a minimum qualification, perhaps graduates in the language themselves, people of proven experience and ability. It isn't beyond the wit of the Ministry of Justice or whoever is responsible for outsourcing to draw up an absolute cast iron rule about the quality of people we employ. The problem seems to me not so much one of outsourcing, but a failure of the civil servants to do their job properly, to work out exactly what the remit should be and insist on the best quality. And in my view, you need to bring the legal profession, the solicitors and barristers in, and people who are tried out in court for the first time must be monitored carefully. And indeed, the legal profession should have a right to say no if somebody isn't doing their job properly. This is basic accountability. It's not a matter of who is doing the job. It's whether we get the specification right to insist on the right quality of person. After all, in the NHS, we insist on qualified doctors. These are independent professionals. They're not GPs are not NHS employees. They contract with the NHS. In many schools now, teachers contract with the school, not the local authority. We need to get interpreting, which is vital to the running of the justice system, on the same basis of professionalism. And from what Nadia said, this is quite possible, only perhaps the company which was given this contract, and I don't know the details, is not fit for its job.
Jonathan, so the answer is supervision.
There's a certain element of truth in that. In this particular case, we know that the civil servants were actually given advice not to offer a huge contract to ALS, and they went ahead and did it anyway. So there's certainly questions that need to be answered about the mechanism through which the government actually commissions these services. Having said that, we do need to be attentive to the problems that can arise when profit-making companies start offering to provide public services. I think there are two basic problems. One is we know that it might not improve quality as much as it should, because they're essentially trying to turn a profit for their shareholders, which might lead them to do things such as we've seen with the ALS, where they've lowered wages, employed unqualified people, and so on and so forth. The second problem that can arise from it is that it can actually end up costing the taxpayer more in the long run, because when something goes wrong, it's the government that has to step in and pick up the bill. So in the ALS example, we see that when court cases get delayed, people have to go back into the cells, and that costs thousands of pounds to keep them. And the same with other public services. We saw when the G4S private company were contracted to do the security at the Olympics, when they failed to oblige, the government had to step in and send in lots of soldiers, which ended up then costing them more money. So I think there are some, although there's an element of truth in the idea that when we decide to outsource services, we need to be very clear about how we monitor and who we give it to. There are some broader questions we do need to answer about whether profit-making companies are the best placed people to run them.
I mean, isn't the problem here that in theory, or one of the sort of advantages of this is supposed to be that you strip back on bureaucracy, but in actual fact, what you're doing is building in another level, as has happened in the NHS. That the private companies don't meet the criteria, therefore you have to establish a public oversight body to do it. What happens in public services is a public service, and the bureaucracy of the public service oversees the thing. So, where's the gain? Do you think the old system was actually superior oversight?
It was much better. As far as I know, there was no complaint.
And what about this problem then, Sheila? I mean, you say, okay, there's problems, and then we have an oversight body. Well, that's exactly what public service does in the first place.
If I may say, this country has lived with this extraordinary, heavily bureaucratized state model since the 1940s. It is not in officials' interests to privatize services. They have no experience of doing so, and on the whole they do it very badly. Indeed, many of the schools we're dealing with today have been in the hands of local councils for a very long time, and giving children, particularly in some of the boroughs of East London, a rotten education amongst the worst in Western Europe. So you can't imagine public sector good, private sector bad. That's not true. If you look at models in Western Europe, where, for instance, in Germany, where half the beds in the German healthcare system are not in state hands, German healthcare is practically second to none in the West. So happens in Switzerland and indeed in France, both of them heavily, France a very nationalized country. So I don't think you can put a blanket public sector good, private sector bad. But what you can do is to build in a model for contracting out. And I don't believe actually officials should be running the show, because time and time again, they get their contracts wrong. They've no experience of doing this. They are very heavily bureaucratized themselves. Even the Ministry of Justice, since the mid-2000s, started bringing in the running of the magistrates' associations into the court service, which is a big central bureaucracy, rather than leaving it with the magistrates, who are doing a perfectly good job.
So if the civil servant, if the problem here is that privatisation's fine, but the civil servants are doing it badly, what are we going to do then? Contract out the contracting out?
No, I think.
Jonathan, do you think that would be a good idea?
I agree with Sheila that sometimes if you have just the state running everything, you can get into trouble because they're a monopoly provider as well, and then you don't get sometimes the dynamism, the innovation that can come from having different people providing public services. Where I profoundly disagree is that you necessarily have to have profit-making companies doing that. In our school system at the moment, we have lots of interesting different providers that are not tied to local authorities running our schools, but they're almost all charities or running it on a not-for-profit basis. So that means you can have lots of different organisations running schools, and you can have the innovation that comes from that, the competition between them to drive up standards. But what you don't have is the profit-making motive. And I think what we see in some services when they get contracted out to companies that make a profit out of the taxpayer money, that creates a whole level of perverse incentives for them to focus on profit rather than service.
So Nadia, do you feel that there could be a contracted out service that would have been as good as the old one?
I'm not sure, but private companies, they pursue their own agenda, and so and usually they've got fragmented policies. If you have different contractors, so the service fragmented, and you get lots of public service principles and values. And is this replaced by monopoly of private one? But the problem as well with private companies, they are not monitored by the government. If they make mistakes, they are not taken into account. So that's one of the problems.
Why do you think, Sheila, in the British Social Attitude Survey, the public opinion has swung so dramatically against privatisation? 85% now against any further privatisation.
Well, public opinion very often will reflect the lead given by politicians. Unfortunately, our politicians have not led from in front when it comes to the benefits of privatisation. If you look at most of the economic studies now done by leading economists in countries which were formerly quite heavily bureaucratised, you will see that if Britain wants to keep its level of public services, including a good, fair justice system, which is even-handed between all people involved, if we want to keep the services we have, the justice system, the public services, health and education, if we want to ensure that policing works, we are going to have to look at cheaper models of running this country. Now, you won't be able to have the services unless you bring the overall cost of government down. At the moment, our GDP, our public spending is around 50% of GDP. That's 50% of everything this nation earns is spent by government. You look at countries we're competing with. You don't just have to look at Asia, where we're looking at figures of 20 and 30% of GDP. Switzerland, 35%. Australia, 42%.
Or the fastest growing economy in the world, which is very heavily state-dominated, China.
Well, this is one of the Asian economies where they do not have big levels of public spending per GDP. It's under 20%. What I'm saying is, if you don't get your public spending down, this country won't grow, it won't compete in the global world, and it won't be able to afford the things that Nadia and I agree with so much, a decent interpretation
So Jonathan,
service.
I mean, that's exactly the theory that the IMF has just said is continuing the recession in this country.
No, I contest this idea that somehow by privatising the public service, you necessarily and are able to do it cheaper. I don't think the evidence does show that. What we see is when many services become privatised, there's a danger that a profit-making company will go into that service, and we saw it with the East Coast Main Line. They'll decide which bits of the service they can run for a profit, and they'll keep them. They'll run the other bits into the ground, and then the state has to step in and buy back those bits of services and continue to run them. So actually, in the long run, the state ends up making a loss. The same when the error with G4S, with the Olympics, and the state had to pick up the tab in the form of sending in more troops. So the idea that by somehow giving the service to a private provider, it will necessarily be cheaper is not actually true.
No, that's to misrepresent the truth. The truth is, as many dispassionate, non-partisan economists will say the world over, we need to build in not private monopolies, but more people providing these services. So why doesn't, for instance, in the interpreting services, I'd love to see a group of very professional interpreters coming together and offering their services, a bit like accountants or lawyers.
Yes, but they need help from
Right,
Ministry of Justice.
and that's what we must get. That
they need a framework
I agree
by
with you.
which they can work.
And that's
they
how
cannot work by themselves.
No, and that's why we really must move this thing forward and get these departments to go further down the route. The regulation department, Department of Biz, is already trying to deregulate those things which are holding up enterprise and new innovative models, social models, business models. But I don't buy the line that if you drive out the private sector, you'll drive down costs. That's complete nonsense. Right across the world, the private sector involved in providing services, indeed for profit or not for profit. In Sweden, they do them for profit. And they make money out of schools, but they also provide one of the better education systems in the world. So it's entirely untrue. In France and in Germany and in Switzerland, you have private companies providing healthcare, and they do very well.
Jonathan, do you think that picture of an economy can ever be, if it ever existed, of competing sort of medium-sized businesses
And charities, whatever you like.
Yeah, but you know, the actual. I mean, I'd love to meet the neutral economist that Sheila's talking about. I've yet to meet one, but if you can bring one onto the programme sometime, that'll be fine. But just let me ask the question. Actually, what you see in the modern world is huge bureaucracies, either private or public. There aren't honestly competing markets of small providers, are they, in areas like the health service or education or court provision? That's not what exists.
Well, it's very difficult to do. The court interpreting is a classic example where the entire contract was given to one company, so it was a private monopoly like that. But I think you can try and balance the power of big monopolies where possible, and I think that's an important thing to try and do. We have seen it beginning with our school system, with some academy chains have been set up on a not-for-profit basis. Then some of them are very good. Arc and Harris in London are often cited. Some of them aren't so good. And so actually, it does help to break up the monopoly.
We'll have to leave it there, I'm afraid, because that's all we've got time for in this part of the discussion. But do join us in the second part of the Politics and Media show in just a moment.